All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Yoga Philosophy Discussion Group coming to you from the Yoga Center of Chico, California. I'm Lauren Carley, and with me is Tom Hess, an owner of the Yoga Center of Chico.
Right.
In this series, we are currently studying Light on Life by BKS Iyengar. Thank you. There it is. And how you can relate the material in this book to your life, your everyday life. And today, specifically, we are studying the first part of chapter 7, Living in Freedom. Each session of the book, each study session of the book, we do live in person at the Yoga Center of Chico, but we also open up a Zoom link for those that are anywhere else or can't make the live session. And then what you have here is the recording of the material that's presented. We don't record the session, but we do record a presentation of the material. In this case, part 1, chapter 7. The live sessions, including the Zoom link, are the fourth Thursday of every month from 5:30 to 7 Pacific Daylight Time. And anyone can join in. The sessions are free. To get the Zoom link and any other information, including how to contact us and get on the mailing list, see the Yoga Center of Chico's website and go to the events, and you will see the Yoga Philosophy discussion group posted there, including the link. So with that, we're going to go into now a brief summary of chapter 7, part 1. I'm going to give my version of it. These chapters in this book are power-packed with a lot of material. So we pick and choose what we think best illustrates the summary of the section, and then Tom will jump in with his view or some things he wants to highlight that I haven't. So chapter 7, Living in Freedom. Let me put it in context. Chapter 6 ended with descriptions and practices having to do with samadhi, something that you can't will upon yourself. It comes to you through dhyana. And in chapter 7, at the beginning, he talks a little bit about samadhi. And in all of his chapters, he does what I call a section on definitions and descriptions. So he talks a little bit about what he's going to talk about and defines it in more detail. And then he gets more into, he being Mr. Iyengar, into the practices. So let me take a look at my notes. He starts chapter 7 with spiritual freedom, the ultimate freedom. As we release our own wants and wishes for a higher purpose and a higher knowledge of, what I really liked here, a higher knowledge of the will of the absolute in our lives, living in spiritual freedom, the will of the absolute in our lives. And this chapter corresponds in the Yoga Sutras to the Kaivalya Pada, the fourth book in the Sutras. Although, from my perspective, the material in Light on Life is a little more accessible than trying to read the Kaivalya Pada. Then he talks about a samadhi as I'll say a summary or a little retrospective, and to be able to launch us into living in freedom. And he says samadhi is a state of being in which you cannot, samadhi is a state of being in which you cannot do. In a state of oneness, you can't operate in a dualistic world. The yogi is never again unaware of the true relationship between nature and the cosmic soul. But this chapter 7 then jumps off from samadhi into, once you come back out, what do you do? How do you live in the world? If you're in samadhi, you're not in a dualistic world, a sense. That's what Iyengar said here. But then, how do you operate once you've been there? How do you operate in the everyday world? And he goes on to say, freedom that comes from realizing that life, freedom comes from realizing that life has nothing to do with perpetuating the existence of our mortal selves, either its physical or its ego forms. Freedom comes from the idea that it's not about perpetuating ourselves. The yogi has taken the opportunity to encounter the imperishable self before all that is transit disappears. It's the dying before you die concept. And then he gets into so some like definitions and descriptions. Then he gets into the challenge for the spiritually free man. Of course, that's women too. Is man in the general sense is to live according to the 5 qualities: courage, vitality, right in useful memory, and total absorption in his activities. So for more detail on the 5 qualities, of course, you want to get into the book on page 229. But then he gives, I think I put a star by things that I think are really important or really profound. Spiritual maturity exists when there is no difference between thought itself and the action that accompanies it. So if you want to practice the 5 qualities, there's something to look for. And I think that we all experience this briefly. It's like Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance, Zen in the art of pulling weeds. And it's where the spiritual maturity exists, where there is no difference between the thought in itself and the action that accompanies it. You're absorbed in your action. And then he says, let's see here. And I think the second part is just as important. He, the yogi, is led from the illuminative wisdom of the core to live a righteous life. He lives from his heart in truth and then expressed in words. So if you're living in a state of freedom, as Mr. Iyengar is describing, where does that come from? That's what he's answering here. It comes from the heart center. You're no longer listening to your ego voice or your intellect or any of that. You're acting from here, nonverbal. Okay, and then moving along, he says so I love this. He says for the average, I'm on page 230 now, for the average practitioner. So even though we haven't reached samadhi, this chapter is still for us. For the average practitioner, remember that learning to live in freedom is a progressive process. It doesn't ding you on the head with a magic wand and just all of a sudden end up there. It's a progressive process as we free ourselves from the habits of the body, emotions, and mind. As we gain greater skill, we must always be mindful of how to use our growing power ethically. Let me go back and say that again. It's a small incremental progressive practice. Yes, going to Sutra 1.2, stilling the fluctuation of the mind. Some people say it's possible. It's possible maybe for a split second or 2 or 3. We're going to get into that in a minute through Shavasana, but bringing it all together where you are totally absorbed is a far reach. Somewhere in our lifetime, we might get there. But in this chapter, he's addressing the average practitioner, you and me. It's a progressive process. So then he jumps off growing power and our growing power ethically, how to operate. So he talks a lot about power. Page 230, the power of psychological insight that the yogi gains, his ability to read people, should be dedicated to their help in evolution. And this is what happens. It begs the question, what if you weren't so distracted in your everyday world? What would happen? This is where Iyengar's going, and this is what he's talking about. What would happen? Do you just sort of zone out? Does your mind open up? Do you see things? Does your power of intuition become stronger? And he's already covered in a separate chapter the power of intuition, how it sits next to the soul. But he does touch on here our ability to read people. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind is as we go deeper and deeper into our practice and become more experienced practitioners, all of that discipline that we gain from the asana practice and the pranayama practice and dharana and dhyana, single point of concentration, comes to bear here as you strip away the excess of everyday life. Your mind opens up and you're able to see, of course, we're talking about with our third eye, which is our consciousness. We're able to see much more clearly. We're looking at the same stuff we've always looked at, but you really can see it for what it is and more clearly. Why? Because we're not saying, oh, it's good or bad, it's black or white, it's pretty or ugly. We're not judging anymore. We're purely seeing. And that's what he's talking about there. A yogi's actions may each be very small, but if each part is perfect and in its time and in its place, there's a cumulative effect. The cumulative effect is considerable. This is really, he didn't use the word karma here, but there's probably 100 different definitions of karma. But this is what he's talking about here, where you take little steps, you do something little every day that is without attachment, you start losing the karmic influence that may come back around because your ego wasn't involved in it. And then he gets to a subsection called Shavasana and time. And I mentioned that he's going to talk about Shavasana here. Now, he's got an interesting description of Shavasana, alluding to Gulliver's Travels and the little people tying you down. But what he's talking about, of course, is all of the little threads that we have in our mind of who we are and what we should be and shouldn't be and all that happy stuff tie us down. And Shavasana, he says, to cut those threads, those attachments, in other words. The result of this is not, as in meditation, freedom, but loss of identity. Now that sounds negative, and I know a lot of people have said, I'm not ready to go there. I'm not ready to surrender myself to a higher being because I can't lose my ego. I can't lose myself, little self. But that is the goal. And I will say that don't worry. Don't be afraid. Just stop worrying about it. You will progressively, as he described in small increments, let yourself go to a point where I'm guessing you will probably want to go in that direction. That's up to you to figure out. But it's not like we're asking anybody, or yoga's asking anybody to leap off of a cliff into the thin air of faith. Shavasana, he says, to cut those threads. The result is not, as in meditation, freedom, but loss of identity. To relax is to cut tension. That's what I'm talking about here. To cut tension is to cut the threads that bind us to our identity. To lose identity is to find out who we are not. It comes out of the Upanishad. Not this, we're not this, we're not this, we're not this, we're not this. This is part of that exercise. And then moving down to page 234, I put 3 stars here. So that means that I thought this was really important. And as I said in the beginning, we pick and choose different parts to illustrate this section. Divorce the present from the past and future. So now we're in Shavasana and divorce the present from the past and future. That way time stops in the eternal present. Shavasana is the key to this understanding. Nothing in our lives links us to the present except the state of being. Nothing in our lives links us to the present except the state of being. Being transcends time. And he said a few times through this section, and Shavasana is the key. Shavasana is the key. That's the practice. So we went from definitions and descriptions into practice. Shavasana is being without was, being without will be. It is being without anyone who is. This is why Shavasana is rated as the hardest pose in asana practice. it is any wonder that it is the most difficult asana and the door to non-dualistic meditation and the cosmic fusion of samadhi. Okay, page 235. A practitioner who can put aside, so again, he's dressing us as far as I'm concerned. A practitioner who can put aside his every identity and accept places where no plump ego can squeeze through. I love that. I love that visual that he gives us there. Life is a series of discrete transformations. We heard that earlier in the chapter. So what he's saying is don't despair. Keep practicing. Practice in little increments. You get these little insights that all string together like sutras. And then he goes on to say, the ultimate yogic triumph is to live in Kaivalya, outside of time. You might say, but really inside it, inside time. Outside, but inside. You can see what's going on, in other words, clearly. It's heart disconnected from the past and from the future. This is to live in the kernel of the present. It is the integration of the true nature of time in consciousness. The integration of the true nature of time in consciousness. So that may all sound beyond you, but it's not. It takes practice, it takes attention, it takes knowledge. This is a knowledge from reading books like this or other books on this subject. I'll just say it helps to have a little bit of a roadmap, which he gives us here. The sutras give us a roadmap. The Bhagavad Gita gives us a roadmap. They all give us a roadmap for the path that we're on, but we have to be able to see it. And if not, we just step forward, we keep stepping forward. Then he finishes this section on the 4 aims of life, talking about living in freedom, that are dharma, cultivation of the right accomplishments, artha, kama, and moksha. And I like moksha is usually translated as freedom. I like what he says here, moksha, 1,000 little freedoms that we accomplish each day. One of the aims of life, 1,000 little freedoms that we accomplish each day. And with that, this is at least my summary and my view of the first half of chapter 7. Let me turn it over to Tom. I'll mute myself.
Okay. Well, thanks, Lauren. I thought you did a very nice job. I think the most important element to this that I got out of this particular section of this chapter is this time element that he talks about in relation to Shavasana, and how that when we are tied in or absorbed or thinking about the past or present, that's not the present moment. And the only time that the present moment exists is when we can get out of our thinking of past and future. And this then echoes a little bit about the whole intention behind or at least in the Yoga Sutras, intention behind yoga, the stilling of the fluctuations of the consciousness. Once you're no longer living in past and future, you're still in that point of time. Now, in that point of time, the now. So it's just interesting to me how he goes into great detail about really describing this here and now, because you hear it a lot. Oh, live in the here and now, be in it. What does that really mean? Well, he says it here. It means you're no longer absorbed with the history or the future, and you're solely focused on what you're doing now, which is what we do all the time in the practice. We focus our attention. So that was the highlight of this chapter for me. So other than that, I thought you did a really nice job of describing it, Lauren. So.
Well, thanks. And I tend to agree with you personally. I don't really try to put my personal view on things here, but it's a practice, I think in summary of the summary, it's a practice that you can use Shavasana as the asana to practice this single point in time. It's also corresponds to the single putting your consciousness on a single point, which is dhyana.
And it also
Yeah.
ties in.
No, dharana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It ties in nicely with what you were saying before of progression is small, little single points and experiences that accumulate over time. They're not like a whole, they're just little bits that are put together. It's not that past and future idea. So,
Yeah. And practice, for example, practice pranayama, conscious breathing, all these different exercises, every possible thing you could do with your breath, right? Pranayama.
yeah.
And then moving into the other limbs of yoga, you step up to it. You can use your shavasana to maybe 1 second of feeling like you're in the present moment, that you're absorbed in it, and your mind isn't bouncing back and forth to past and future. And then maybe the next day or the next week or month, you get 5 seconds of it. You build it in the same way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
With that, we'll wrap it up.
Sounds good. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.